This is a short video on learning how to work with complex sentences and reading through a complex text by picking apart specific pieces out of a sentence and really figuring out how we can use what's already in a sentence to make sense of what that is. And specifically, we're looking at punctuation and the small linking words in a sentence because punctuation in those small words like and, but, for, or, and then prepositions like with, on, for, at, by, in between, in order to, all those small words that give us more information. Those words are super important. We often overlook them, but that's like, those words are our signal words, like a roadmap to understand a sentence. So we don't want to overlook them. So I'm going to go through this sentence in our current speech by Mariah W. Stewart. What makes this sentence complex is that not only is it long, but there are multiple clauses. And I don't want to get too much into grammatical words because we don't need to know the grammatical terms, but there are multiple phrases, right, that are separated out by conjunctions like and, or, but, or separated by punctuation like commas or dashes or semicolons or colons. So the very first thing you want to do when you're reading is to find the subject and the verb, to pull them out, to isolate them, because a sentence at its very core is just a subject and a verb. So I always say, a very simple sentence is, I walk. There's the subject, I, and the verb walk. The subject is the person or thing doing the action. So like I always think the subject is the actor of what's going on in that sentence. So usually that subject, for the most part, is going to be a noun, right? A person, place, or thing. So let's pull out and isolate just our simple sentence, just the core, the subject and the verb. So I am looking at this. I do know that methinks is I think, right? And so the subject would be I, and the verb would be think. That's it, I think. Okay, fine. So now we need to figure out what makes this sentence complex and what does that complex sentence mean by now noticing everything that comes around, in this case, after the subject and the verb of I think. So she tells us what she thinks, and this is in the green, more information about the subject. The main idea is in here. Remember the universal idea, the abstract noun is in here, and active reading always means pulling out that universal idea, pulling out that abstract noun, right? And often that is the main idea. So we have to figure out, well, what is this abstract noun or main idea universal idea in this green part of the sentence, in this main idea part of the sentence? So I think there are no chains so galling as the chains of ignorance. And that's hard to see because I put that box on there. Now, don't read the rest of the sentence right now. Just stick with the green part, right? Because this is her main idea, right? So this on its own can be a sentence. There are no chains so galling as the chains of innocence, right? So the subject of the sentence would be chains, right? And she's basically saying that the chains of ignorance exist. So the universal idea would be ignorance. It's a universal idea because it is abstract, but we do know it exists, and we can say we feel it, or we have emotion next to it, or we have a picture of it, but we can't buy it, sell it, touch it, feel it, hold it. It's not something that we can hold in our hand. It's abstract. And she extends this by using a metaphor connected by of, right? So chains of ignorance. Okay, so that's our main idea, chains of ignorance. She could have just said ignorance. She could have just said, chains, but chains is real. It's not abstract. We can touch it, hold it. But she added that information to describe ignorance, that ignorance really, think about what a chain does. Ignorance really, she's saying in this case, this is the kind of ignorance that binds us, that holds us back. You have to think what chains do. It's a negative connotation. It's often used with images of slavery, and that is the topic of her speech, right? So the next thing we want to do, we found the universal idea or abstract noun. Now we need to locate signal punctuation. And again, this is a comma, this is a dash, this is a colon or semicolon. In this case, it is the dash. Dashes are awesome. I love dashes because they're easy to spot and they really stand out, but they really do mean the same thing as a comma, a semicolon, a colon, and that is everything. You have to look to the left of the dash, to the right of the dash, and whatever is left and right, it's like that scale, they're both equal. Or the right part of the dash, the piece that comes after the left part of the dash, that right part is more information or a synonym to what comes before. So it's kind of like a big clue. In this case, it is more information about the chains of ignorance. So not only is she creating this horrific, specific image of ignorance, right? But she's giving us more information about ignorance. And I always say, look, you could stop reading, and you really could, after the green part. You have the main idea, you have the universal idea. She does something, awesome as a writer and gives us more information. She creates a vivid picture with ignorance by using chains of ignorance. But you would lose the depth following that dash if you didn't read it. And your analysis wouldn't be strong. It wouldn't be as strong. You're not going into the depth of analysis if you don't read the rest of the sentence. But the point is, we're chunking a sentence. And as long as you have that main idea, the subject and verb, you have the core. So she tells us more about the chains of ignorance. No fetter so binding as those that bind the soul. Okay, so we could take two roads here. We could freak out because already she said methinks, and now she's saying fetters, and I have no idea what. It doesn't matter. Don't stress out about it, because we're replacing fetters with something that we think we kind of know what it means with a word we know. For instance, something is so binding. So what is something that binds us so tight, right? So that we can replace that with fetters. Something, or just have something, right? Replace the word fetters with the word something. Something so binding as those that bind the soul. So no, whatever that thing is, we know it's a noun. No, nothing so binding as those that bind the soul. So she's saying what with the chains of ignorance? She's giving us more information about binding and how we are bound by the chains of ignorance. And she's giving us more information with binding the soul. So not only does the chains of ignorance hold us back, but they're so strong, right, that they bind the soul. And then we have another signal punctuation with this comma. And again, you could stop with this image of chains of ignorance and binding the soul, but we want to definitely look what comes after that comma to build and deepen our analysis. And this part is comma. Now we know commas are awesome, just like dashes. They give us more information. They possibly give us a synonym or a likeness to what has come before. So if we don't understand one part of either before or after the signal punctuation, in this case, comma, we can just pick up one side of it and we can infer the other side of it based on what we know of the side we understand. So again, I'm starting to, when I read, see commas and dashes and colons as gold. It's like, okay, this is going to tell me what's on. If I can figure out left or right side of that signal punctuation, I got it because it's telling me more information or it's providing a likeness or similarity. So in this case, she's giving us more information about these. Backtrack it. What is she talking about? The chains of ignorance, the chains. They bind the soul. Now I'm going to find the verb, right? Not only do they bind one verb, they're going to exclude, the chains exclude it from the vast field of usefulness and knowledge, scientific knowledge. So you could just end like they exclude and they bind. Like if I'm reading this whole thing and I get lost with this information, you got to figure out, chunk it down. What do they do? What are the verbs? What is the subject and the verb? Chains of ignorance or ignorance, subject, bind, exclude, verb, done. Because then I can get detailed information about what they do and move on. So still working with the same sentence, we're going to look for two more reading strategies. This one would be prepositions and signal words. So before we had signal punctuation, now let's think of prepositions. So these prepositions are these small words. I think that, again, it's like gold. If you can begin to know what a preposition is, that's a signal to you that the writer is just extending the writing. When I say to you, extend your reasoning, extend your sentences, one sure way to do it is to add prepositions. So in order to, so, for, in order to, so is not one. For, in order to, with, so when I was in 8th grade, I learned the preposition song. I'm not going to sing it here, but I use it in my head still to this day. With, on, for, after, at, by, in, against, instead of, in between, for, over, on, according to, around, about, beyond, into. So those are prepositions, right? Prepositions are known as like anything a cat can do. So a cat can jump on, a cat can go under, a cat can go around. But there's also words like for, to, after, those words. And they're directional words, like they point us in a different direction, they tell us a direction, but in a sentence, they give us the direction of moving forward, adding more information. So why are they important to understanding and to reading? Because if I can spot a preposition, I can chunk a sentence. I can say, all right, I'm going to stop reading before the preposition and just figure out what is this first chunk. And I know, you got to tell yourself, I know that all this preposition is just icing on the cake. It is more information. It's more detail. It's extending the thought. I'm not saying don't read after a preposition. I'm saying you gotta get small in a sentence, in a complex sentence, to understand the different pieces of it. This will also prevent you from, it prevents me from getting overwhelmed. It's a way to understand pieces. So I'm going to stop at this preposition. I see from, right? From gives more information. And if I stop and I cross this out, because yeah, in theory, I could stop with exclude. The chains of ignorance exclude. But if I want deeper analysis, she's going to tell me how they exclude with this from, with this preposition. So everything after it, icing on the cake, but still important. They exclude the, right? What? They exclude it. We have to figure out what it is, but they exclude it from the vast field of usefulness and scientific knowledge. Okay, so let's figure out what it is first. This is our other strategy in reading. But before we do that, we're saying something is excluded, that it is excluded from being useful and having real knowledge, scientific knowledge that I can put my finger on. So let's figure out by tracing the pronoun what it is. So if I see it right here, again, like gold, you got to find those pronouns and don't overlook them. Trace it back to what it is. I see that it, go back, what's the first noun, the first thing after the it? It is the soul. And then I'm going to find the verb. The soul is excluded. What is it excluded from? You find the preposition from. Everything after being useful and having knowledge. So put it all together. The universal idea, the chains of ignorance, bind us. And more than that, they bind our soul. And more than that, they exclude us from being useful and having knowledge. So we are useless, right? She's saying we people, enslaved people and formerly enslaved people, as she is included in that we, are excluded. Our soul is excluded, she is saying, from being useful and having the opportunity to have this real scientific knowledge. So how did we figure that out? Well, we trace the pronoun it back to the thing that she's talking about to understand what the usefulness and scientific knowledge is talking about, and then the verb, because the soul is excluded. So one thing I want to ask myself here, always when I find a pronoun like it, them, they, right? I tell you in your own writing that if you have a lot of these, it, them, they, then they're not clear, right? And you have to clarify what they are, like name the it. So you have to ask yourself as a reader, well, what is it? What is the pronoun? And then what is happening to it, the pronoun, and that's the verb. So here I would ask, what is it and what is being excluded? So that's a very deep dive into close reading strategies that will come in handy with anything you read. I use them all the time. One is trace the pronoun back to the thing that pronoun is replacing and what that thing is doing by locating the verb. The other strategy is locate those prepositions, those small little words, and then know that everything after that preposition is like extra information, will help deepen your analysis, right? And then locate the signal words, the conjunctions, and, but, for, or, nor, yet, so. Those are your conjunctions. Everything after that is like a likeness to what comes before, or even more information from what comes before. One more thing, if you see a word you do not understand, chances are if there's a comma after that word with another word, it doesn't matter. As long as you understand one word on either side of that comma, you can figure out the likeness of the word. As long as you know a synonym or a similar word, right? And that's noted by the comma in between words. And then finally, we are locating the subject and the verb, the core sentence. We're isolating it and know that what comes after that core, sometimes before that core, will be your main idea. You locate that universal idea or abstract noun, and then you can also locate your signal punctuation. Remember that punctuation is gold in a sentence. It'll tell you more information and help you chunk and break down the pieces of a sentence. So when we have a complex sentence, we know that we can handle it by finding the parts of it, isolating the parts of it, understanding one part at a time, and then piecing it back together. So important, though, to read for universal ideas. This will center your reading and give your mind a clear direction.